So hi, I'm Arnav. My voice sounds like this. My favorite game to play is Hearthstone, and I do not collect butterflies. Let's get into some modeling, some framework, and then our two substantive arguments. Okay, I hope my opponents and my judges agree. This debate is not just about three questions compared to three questions. That's not what we're debating here today. We're debating about ideas and what you want to learn about people to get to better know them. So I'm going to give you some very clear modeling so that we're debating like an actual motion and not some like random nitty gritty three questions that like no one really cares that much about. So basically we say that like when we're talking about this, right, you're trying to ask questions about someone, let's give some contextualization. So like we get more like information about what are we asking. We think like it makes sense to be like this house would be like someone looking for a friend, and right, like so you're asking questions to someone to figure out like if they're worth spending time with. I think that's sort of like a fair model for this round. It sort of like shows like what the objective asking person with these questions is, so get to better know them. And who else wants to get to better know someone than someone who's trying to look for a friend, right? And so then what is the comparative? What type of questions are we talking about? We think generally what we're saying aside affirmative says is that like we would rather ask qualitative questions over quantitative questions. That's sort of like the big picture of this round. It's like the, I guess, philosophical backing, if you want to say that. I don't want to get caught up in like comparing three questions to three questions because it's going to result in a really boring round. And then so what does this usually result in? We'd say qualitative questions are usually ones that sort of try to gauge like the character of the individual. In quantitative questions, try to gauge like basically the accomplishments or like what that individual has actually done with their life and like what like they are like quantitatively, I guess, but like usually it's more like based off accomplishments and outcomes, while characteristics are like qualitative sort of leads you to finding like characteristics of an individual. Yeah, you may find some like small questions that overlap, but this is like sort of like what the questions generally lend themselves to. So let's talk about the framework. We think the framework for this round should be whichever type of questions, qualitative versus quantitative, better allow you to evaluate whether the person being questioned would be a good friend. So like I think that's like pretty fair given like the actor and our characterization. If side opposition wants to challenge it, it's their prerogative. We think it's fair and it lends itself to a better debate than saying what three questions are good. I just don't think that debate is very fun or good in any way. Let's go into our contentions. So first, our first contention tells you qualitative questions help you gauge if the person is like sort of like worth spending time with insofar as like if they have good character, if you will enjoy the time you spend with them. We think like crucial to this is first noting what makes a good friend. We think like three main factors are like this emotional caring for others, because if you're trying to make a friend, you hope they care about you. So like they should be emotionally caring. Like two, having mutual interest. Three, having respect for people, because again, if you're trying to make a friend, you hope they will respect you. So let's go into these, how these questions help gauge if this person is a moral actor or like a good actor, just someone you're willing to spend time with. So first of all, we'd like to like state that like likely there aren't that many quantitative questions that tell you like how a person will act. Like, yeah, you're able to ask like quantitative questions about like what they've specifically done, but you don't actually get that much insight into how they've done it. We think that qualitative questions better let you do that. Let's go into this example. This will be an example of one of the three questions, right? If you ask someone what their favorite game is, basically anything related to do with their hobbies, it helps you gauge and gain insight into that person's value. How? It first of all tells you what they do, and likely in answering that question, it'll tell you why they do it. You get insight into their motivators in doing specific actions. Generally, people have similar motivators in all actions they take. So if someone tells you, for example, they prefer chess, it's likely because right, they are maybe more strategic as a person. Maybe they're a little bit slower paced and they like thinking things through. These things give you insight into how they act as a person, allowing you to better gauge if you would like spending time with them. And like on the other hand, like if someone likes Egyptian rat screw, they're probably like really fast with things. Maybe their personality is a little bit aggressive, a little bit more outgoing. They like doing like faster paced things. We think this is crucial for finding a good friend. Why? Because we think when you have friends who are trying to like do something together, right, or like trying to have a good relationship, it's important that your personalities mesh well, right? We say that specific type of people probably don't fit together well. And you, as a person who's asking these questions, likely know what characteristics don't rub well with you. For example, if you're someone who likes chess, who likes like taking things slower, if this person is like super fast paced, is like really high, like tensioned about everything, they could really cause you stress and like not, you wouldn't have a good time with them. We think getting insight into how they act helps you find out if you would be able to enjoy that time with them, which is really crucial to having like good, long-lasting friendships, which is something I think the actor wants to do. We think further, like through the exploration of hypothetical scenarios, through like qualitative questions, which really like talk about like what their values are, right? We'd say like you can probably also gauge their morality, who they are as a person, and the better understanding you get of that, the better you know if that person would fit into your life as a friend. Our second contention is that mutual interests are important to friendship compatibility. Crucially, we'd say that asking qualitative questions also gives you the ability to ask about like what they enjoy to do, right? And this is a little bit, this is different than our first contention. Why? The first contention is about getting like insight into why they do things, how they act. The second contention was just like getting insight into what they do, right? And in doing so, you get insight into what they enjoy spending time into. For example, if I ask Robert whether like he likes debate, I think him saying yes means that there's probably a higher chance of me and Robert being good friends because we have a shared activity that we both enjoy, that we can spend time together doing, and that we can talk about, right? And you can get like these friendship experience through this interaction. We'd say that basically these qualitative questions allow you access to gauging a person's interests, and that's really crucial to friendship compatibility, because like even if, right, you guys are the same morally, like the exact same, like you believe in the same values, if you don't have any way to spend your time together, there's really no point in that person being your friend, right? Because I have people I know that I agree with on most things. We just don't have anything in common. There's no games we play together. There's no like interests we share. And insofar as that is true, the thing what ends up happening is you have no way to actually spend time together. We think that's also a crucial part of having a friend, is actually being able to spend time with them so that friendship actually has any sort of meaning. We think that qualitative questions allow you to dig into interests they share, allowing you to better find out if this person would be a good friend for you. For these two reasons, because you want to find out if the friend fits good with your personality, and if you actually have the ability to spend time, or spend good time with them, I'm so proud to propose.
Okay, great, thanks. You have 8 minutes.
Okay, is everybody ready? Correct. And if anyone can't hear me at some point during the debate, I've had a couple of issues with the internet where I've cut out. Just let me know so that I can pause and we can resume. With that being said, I am going to start my time now. Honorable Speaker, my voice sounds like this. I quite like debate. I don't collect butterflies. Now, what have you actually learned of me? What do you actually know of me as a result of these questions? And I'd argue very, very little, because you've just wasted 2 questions, because you know exactly how my voice sounds, because you just heard it. And you know I like debate because I'm currently debating, right? So what we're talking about in this debate is actually a certain set of questions. And ultimately, some of them are answers are obvious in their actual questions themselves. And I'm going to get into this more in my actual case, but I first want to start with the discussion of the molding and framework that they provided. Because when we think it's reasonable, we think they give some unfair burdens to opposition. Because they say that we should be talking about ideas, about this qualitative type of question and this quantitative type of question. And while we certainly think that expansion to a general idea of quality versus quantity is reasonable and fair, and that their contentions are totally valid in this respect, we don't think it's fair for them to put a burden on us that we must do the same thing, that we must also expand exclusively to this idea of quality versus quantity. Because we think that these 6 specific questions have a nuance that goes beyond that. And therefore, they need to be addressed in their own right for the questions themselves. And so we ask that because of the wording of the resolution, which is specifically talking about asking questions, that when we do expand to these broader ideas, ultimately, we also bring them back down to the questions themselves. We show how the two connect. We think the sidebar resolution have done a good job of this so far in today's debate, but we'd like to ask that this be consistent. We're not just talking about quality and quantity here, we're talking specifically about questions that we can expand to that extent of quality versus quantity. So with that all addressed, we want to say that their general idea of framework of we want to have a better evaluation, what can be evaluated better, is a good one. And we absolutely concede to this framework. We think it should be how we go forward in this debate. So all that laid out, and we'll talk about this more as we go through the round, as I'm sure there's some contention there. I'm going to go through my 3 points, my 3 contentions. The first is information. The second is depth and reflection. And the third is practicality. So let's start with this first contention, that of information. Because I'd argue that actually those second questions just matter more. They're more significant and they're more important. And while this may be true of general quantifiable questions versus qualitative ones, I'm going to talk more specifically about these questions and their nuance right now. Because ultimately, those questions that I first asked just aren't that important. We don't think it matters that much whether you collect butterflies or not. And in fact, when you can only ask certain questions, but not ask those other ones, we think it's important to ask the ones that give you more information. Because we think that in correspondence with their exact framework about evaluation, the more information you have about a person, the better you can evaluate that friendship. We think that that relationship is linear. The more information, the better your evaluation. We think this is a necessary way of evaluating this round because that is an important part of this contention.
Point.
Go ahead.
Oh, so you're saying that the more information, the better, but doesn't the quality of that information also matter in evaluating whether you can better know about this friend?
Yeah, absolutely. And we're actually kind of talking about that too, because you can't really say like which one is more information, because you're still getting 3 pieces of information either way, right? Yeah, so good clarification. I think that is kind of what we're talking about. Which information is more useful is a lot of good way to say it. Like how much useful information do you actually have? So we would argue that the second questions just have to give you infinitely more, because no matter what those answers to the first question is, you can only draw so much without actually assuming a bunch of things. And I'm going to get into that more in my third contention too, but that's what I want you to think about first. Which information is actually more necessary in day-to-day life? Now, second, I want to talk about depth and reflection. Now, there's a reason that I answered the first questions opposed to the second ones when I just introduced my speech. That's because the second ones, they're prying questions. They're personal questions that I'm less considerate to actually answer. I don't want to tell all of you my weight or tell all of you my age or how much money my dad makes. These are all questions that are prying, that are difficult, that are therefore more engaging. This is an important difference because this isn't about quality versus quantity. This is about the difficulty of these questions, which I think is inherent. It's a lot easier to answer those first questions. So why is it important to ask prying questions? Well, because they actually lead to more expansion. And while sure, this is about the questions and their answers, it's also about what happens when you ask the questions. It's talking about in the resolution, asking the questions, not just like receiving the answers from them. And that's important because in today's debate, we argue that those second questions actually lead to more discussion because it's not just a direct answer, but actually gives you a little bit of elaboration. And while that can be true for the first questions, I'm never going to expand anything more beyond I do collect butterflies or I don't collect butterflies. Maybe I give you an instance of which butterflies I've collected if I do, but that isn't inevitable. Particularly for the first question, what does my voice sound like? It's very difficult for me to actually expand on this at all. But when I'm forced to answer prying questions like how much money does my father make, I will necessarily give a little bit of qualification, a little bit of clause of here's why, here's different things that are aspects that affect that. I'm unlikely to just give you a dollar amount and move on with my life. So this means you have more reflection. So if we're going back into this idea of useful information, you actually receive more by asking the second question because they lead to more discussion of those actual topics. We think it's important in this debate because it means you have more useful information, which is how we should be judging evaluation under their framework. So with those two things expanded, I want to go into our third contention. That's about simple practicality. I pointed this out at the very beginning of my speech. You could have answered those first two questions without me saying anything. And so because you can only ask certain questions and not others, we argue that you actually get information about those first questions by just observing me. You know my voice without asking about it. You know whether I like debate without asking about it. And so we should actually be asking about things that we can't see intrinsically to be true, because those will be better questions that give us more information. You just wasted 2 questions with the first 2 that affirmation proposes. And that's really damaging because these qualitative questions can be seen. The quality of my life can be seen outside, whereas you can't see exactly how old I am or exactly how much I weigh. These are important questions, and therefore the practicality of asking certain ones means you can actually glean more information by asking the questions that actually matter and that aren't otherwise obvious. Again, we're looking for the most useful information in order to make this evaluation, and if we already know the answers to certain questions without asking them, there's no reason to waste some of our questions on those answers that we already know. So with that being addressed, I want to go into their 2 contentions. And the first is gauging worth. They argue that actually quantitative questions quantitative questions don't expand, right? They don't actually lead to more discussion, and that you can gauge more from qualitative questions just because they're about quality of life and you can see where interests lie. And we have 2 responses to this. First of all, that quantitative questions also have this result, that you actually do have more reflection, more depth in the answers to these questions, because oftentimes just a single number doesn't give the full context. And humans necessarily try to give the full context. They try to give an answer that makes more sense. So they won't just be giving a number to quantitative questions. It's also about the reflection that follows that. Now, secondly, we argue that actually you can find the answers to the qualitative questions that they propose without asking them. This goes back to our own case, but here it particularly follows. They said, if I enjoy a certain game, like Pokemon, I can tell that because I might be playing that game. So we can't be wasting questions on qualitative ones when quantitative ones can actually lead to more reflection and better answers overall. Now, secondly, they talk about mutual interests. You can figure out what people enjoy to do by asking questions of a qualitative nature. But again, we think this follows the same general trend of, well, you can still get that with quantitative questions. And then again, you don't want to be asking questions about states that you can definitely see, qualities of life you can already are observant and can be seen by an actual person. And so sometimes mutual interests do come from numbers. This is the second rebuttal to this point. Essentially, if I'm trying to decide whether I want to be friends with somebody, I'd quite like to know their age. Especially if in an online context, I want to know someone if someone is 11 or 36. That makes a massive difference. And so this idea that quantitative questions just don't matter in this space and that they actually don't demonstrate mutual interest is just totally invalid, because quantitative questions can still have the aspect, and we'd argue that actually one of the important quantitative questions that are actually laid out is exactly that. If I'm trying to figure out whether to be friends with someone, I need to know whether they're 11 or they're 36. And on an online space where I can't see their face, it's impossible for me to do so without actually seeing this. And even on a more specific level, I'd like to know whether they're 14 or 17, things like this. These are important questions that are quantitative, but that still demonstrate mutual interest, whether I actually want to be friends with someone. So honorable speakers, judges, when you're looking at this debate, I want you to think about the questions themselves, because sure, there's the idea of quality versus quantity, but ultimately this resolution lays out very clearly a question. This House would ask the first 3 questions. It's not asking whether we would ask this type of question. It's asking about these questions specifically, and the author picks them deliberately. And for these reasons, honorable speaker, I strongly support an opposition ballot. Thank you very much.
Okay, Gov, you have 8 minutes.
All right. Just a quick offset roadmap. I'm going to be answering the first set of the 3 questions, then going into an observation about like the nature of the questions, then talking about the opposition case, and finally, I'll be going over my own case. All right. With that being said, I'd like to start now. So actually, before I answer the questions about myself, just to quickly hit on like the sort of there's kind of an abuse claim, like a little bit. Basically, what you get from opposition is that it's an unfair burden on opposition to expand the debate past those questions. We think that it's totally in the power of government to model past the questions. Obviously, there is a lot of focus on the questions from both cases, but we also think that considering the modeling that government gives you, it's important for you as judges to not just evaluate on these 6 questions, but also on these entire ideas of qualitative and quantitative. I think just wanted to make that clear. So let's answer the first 3 questions. I'll answer them myself. What does my voice sound like? My voice is a voice of debate. My voice is a voice that cares about political issues, social justice. I consider myself an advocate for a certain amount of things. I consider myself an influence upon my friends. I think I have unique perspectives that I can educate a lot of them on. What is my favorite game? I consider myself a chess person, actually. I find that it depends a lot on individual strategy more than most things. And do I like collecting butterflies? No, not necessarily. I don't really collect butterflies. So let's talk about these 3 questions, because the opposition seems to really want to focus in on these 6 questions, the 2 question sets. So let's talk about them. Now, I think it's pretty obvious why opposition comes in and tells you that these questions are shallow on both sides. It's because it fits their narrative, right? Quantitative questions that they present to you are inherently shallow. That is what comes with those questions. But the qualitative questions are not shallow just because opposition tells you they are. What you get from Arnav's speech is analysis about how qualitative questions, even if they don't lead to more discussion, actually lead to a lot more insight. Even if you were to believe that when you ask them how much they weigh in pounds, they would spend hours talking about how much they weigh and why. And yet, if you ask them about their favorite game, they're going to give you a 1-sentence answer. If you can deduce more from that 1-sentence answer, then it doesn't matter how much they talk about their weight. So let's talk about these 3 questions. Let's talk about the answers I give you. When I'm asked what my voice sounds like, it's not just about the pitch of my voice. It is about what my voice says. It is about what I use my voice for. It tells you about the kind of person I am. No, thank you. No, I'm not going to take a PLI right now. It tells you about the kind of person I am, the kind of action I will take, and the kind of relationship you will have with me. When I tell you that I prefer chess over other games, you learn about me that I really value strategy, that I value objective truth in life over other games like, let's say Egyptian rat screw, which would make me, more about competition and aggressiveness. And when you learn that I don't like chasing butterflies, you can gain a lot of insight about me spending my time on more pragmatic things, right? You can learn about my ambitions and, my commitment to getting actual value out of my life and not maybe wasting time on activities such as collecting butterflies. Now, what if you asked me the other 3 questions, the 2 sets? Let's talk about this, because you get analysis from opposition here about how it's great because they're prying questions, right? So I think that the responses I just gave, just to sort of give you a little context on flow, sort of responds to that first contention about information. I tell you why it doesn't matter how long the conversation is after, you get more information from the first set. I think it's obvious. Now I'm talking about their second contention about depth. So let's talk about what happens when you ask those prying questions. Let's say you ask me how much I weigh. You don't know, this might be, as opposition tells you, a sensitive question for me. And let's say that you believe opposition. I'm going to give you a lot of context. I'm going to tell you like down to the, I don't know, exact like 0.03 of pound. I'll tell you about like my workout routine. I'll tell you like what food I eat to maintain my weight. I don't know, something like that. What info do you gain from that? All that you gain from that is that you initiate the friendship by making me uncomfortable and showing me you care only about my physical features, right? My quantitative features. So what do you gain from prying? You gain nothing. You make me uncomfortable. You initiate the friendship on a basis of caring only about quantitative measures. You gain nothing. I've already shown you why you gain less info. No, thank you. I'm not going to take a PLI right now. They tell you essentially that it's going to lead to elaboration. And there's 2 reasons why this point falls. The first one is they are assuming that you're going to have elaboration on the opposition's like second set of questions, but not on the first set. I think it's very dependent on the person. I think some people will be asked a question and decide to talk more about it. Some won't be. I don't think there's any warranting for why people will respond to an uncomfortable question, but not to another one. I think if anything, when you ask somebody a question about their weight, they become turned off immediately. They don't want to talk to you. If you came up to me as somebody that I've never met before, and you immediately ask me how much money my dad makes, I will most likely walk away because I don't want to interact with you. Whereas if you ask me what games I like to play, if you ask me what my voice sounds like, what I talk about, I become engaged, right? I understand that there's a lot more to explore there, and I want to talk about it. So I think it's obvious who wins on elaboration. But Judge, let's say that you don't buy either of that, right? Let's say that you have all this hours of conversation about how much you weigh on op, and just 1 sentence answers. I've already told you why that opposition answer, no matter how long you talk about it, gives you no insight into the person past their physical features. So all of the context that you can gain from even a 1-sentence answer of that first set of questions far outweighs the tiny amount of like arbitrary info you gain from even hours of conversation about how much you weigh. Let's talk thirdly about their third question. They talk to you about practicality, right? They tell you that you're going to see the first 2 questions, right? They talk first about voice and about game, right? Those are the 2 questions they address first. They tell you, you find those out no matter what. Now, I'll tell you why that's flawed. It's flawed on the voice issue because they misrepresent what that question means, and on the game issue because they're approaching it as if we're all in a debate together. Obviously, we know that you like debate because we're at a debate tournament. But according to the resolution, this is somebody that's new. You don't know them. You have no context. So for some reason, the opposition has decided to ignore this entire question about game and everything that it comes with because they claim that like you're already going to know that you like debate. I think that's a misunderstanding. I think it's obvious. Everything we've said about this question still stands. Let's talk about the voice question. The only reason they approach it so shallowly, as my voice sounds like this, you gain nothing from that, you already knew that if you're talking to me, is because they know that if you go any deeper into that question, look at what it really says, it automatically falls towards government advocacy. When you ask someone about what their voice sounds like, that implies, what is your voice saying? What are you speaking? Do you care about what you say? Do you care about your words? Are you careful with how you speak and the articulation? Do you value your influence upon other people? If you talk about practicality, this entire contention is essentially based off of a misrepresentation of the resolution, where they tell you that we're all in a debate round, whereas if you look at me and Arnav's modeling, we're talking about somebody finding a friend. You don't know if you have common interests. You need to find out through qualitative questioning. Let's move on to their responses to our case for the remaining of the time. To our first contention, they essentially tell you, again, they tell you that like humans are going to give you more context for the second set of questions. I've already disproven that. They also, they're already give you analysis on why not wasted questions. Now, on the second one, they basically tell you that quantitative questions like those 3 will give you mutual interests. Is it a mutual interest how much you weigh or how much your dad makes? I don't care how much Arnav's dad makes. That tells me nothing. But I do care what game he likes, right? I care that he cares about debate or something else. That gives us a mutual interest to create a friendship upon. And again, their only other point here is about age. If you're seeing each other, right? If you're talking to each other, or even online, you can find other ways to gauge age, right? If they tell you that you can gauge all of these other things and there's all these wasted questions, you can also gauge age. Also, just through qualitative questions, you can learn about how a person speaks. Like if somebody is 7 years old and you're 43, it's going to become very obvious. We on the government believe in advocacy that empowers actual real friendship built on fundamental things. That is why I'm incredibly proud to propose. Thank you.
Okay, great. You have 8 minutes.
As a brief offset roadmap, I will address the nature of all of the 6 contentions before moving on to rebut our opponent's 3 contentions and rebuilding our own. Honorable Speaker, side government has clearly painted the second questions as unimportant and face value and not contributing to deeper reflection. But this is absolutely a misconstruction of what these questions can actually mean. They, for some reason, believe the questions like, does he collect butterflies, to which I would answer no, will somehow stimulate the same kind of self-reflection and mutual response that you see from a question like, for example, how much does he weigh? Side government paints this question as one that is completely irrelevant and face value and will instantly demean someone. For me personally, if you ask me this question, I would go through my past 5 years going through obesity, injury that's contributed to physical problems for me, and that would create a massive amount of deep reflection that would make me very interested in understanding why this person wants to know that kind of deep self-reflection. Clearly, if we're trying to build these friendships based on actual deep reflection and understanding actual deep value, there is no reason to say that these second questions do not stimulate that kind of conversation and reflection. And saying that questions like, what is his voice sound like, even if side believes that that is not a very face value question, and that does he collect butterflies somehow stimulates this mutual interest creation and this deeper reflection that stimulates friendships. This is quite an absurd question. If we think more broadly about these questions as quantitative versus qualitative, it's pretty unfair to say that does he collect butterflies is an actually qualitative question that stimulates this deep reflection that side government would like to propose. Side opposition argues that these questions are impractical, do not contribute to actual societal value, do not stimulate actual deep, meaningful reflection that side government would like you to believe it does, and that the second sequence of questions, including age, weight, and monetary value of one's father, actually stimulate much, much deeper reflection and build these connections as we've seen. I'll begin by rebutting our opponent's 2 contentions of 1, gauging character, and 2, the creation of mutual interest before moving on to rebuild our own 3 points. For the first contention of qualitative questions gauging character, once again, I urge, Honorable Speaker, I urge distinction at what qualifies as these qualitative questions that enlist massive response and reflection to create these deeper reflective friendships. How can we say that collecting butterflies and learning what one's voice sounds like actually stimulates this type of deep reflection that leads to these connections? It's pretty unfair to assume that these questions that are clearly meant from a very juvenile perspective have anything to do with the nuances and realities of a rapidly aging person trying to make friends, having new experiences, to which the second sequence of questions clearly develops a much deeper and more illicit response. This is abundantly clear. And as we see from these questions, as we see from this actual quote, we're stating that grown-ups don't ask these first set of questions because simply they are not relevant. They are not stimulating the actual amount of response that we need because grown-ups understand that these questions do not have any practical relevance to what they want to understand in terms of building a connection with that person. They understand that these second questions, even if they may, to the untrained perspective on what these questions mean, seem face value and not deep and causing of deep reflection, clearly these second sequence of questions, as they are often asked, stimulate massive connections and intellectual responses that the first ones could possibly not match, because I am not instantly going to become your friend because you tell me you collect or not collect butterflies. For their second intention of the building of mutual interest, once again, this follows the same sequence. This follows the same theme in this debate. The first questions that they have posed do not elicit the same kind of mutual interest in the same way that the second questions do. What we should be considering is that in building these friendships, targeting deeper questions that elicit a actual practical response that is reflective and causes a real connection is more important at the first stages of making this friendship. After that, we can find these almost insignificant values of collecting butterflies and board games that stimulate a prolonged actual connection. But these deep human connections can only be made with these deep intellectual questions that we see in the second sequence here in this quote. I'll now move into rebuilding side oppositions. Three main contentions of 1, information; 2, depth and reflection; and 3, practicality. For our first contention of information, once again, the first questions simply do not provide the adequate information that we need in a modern society where one is trying to make friends. If we are asking these second questions, once again, we're stimulating clear illicit response that determines an actual human connection. It is practically relevant in the status quo because, as we see in the resolution, grown-ups gravitate towards these second questions for that very reason. They elicit an actual human response and understand the reality of a situation. They can elicit these connections. And the first questions are simply unable to do that because of how very frivolous the nuances they represent are. For our second intention of depth and reflection, once again, in the previous speech, they brought up this example that how much does he weigh, even if you go into this very exaggerated 0.01 description of weight, that it is a completely face value that does not determine any actual deep, meaningful connection. Honorable speakers, I fail to see how this is a realistic point. If we're asking these deep reflective connections and questions as a whole, we are elaborating on these past human experiences that create these friendships. If we get stuck on frivolous questions, collecting butterflies and what your voice sounds like and your favorite board game, we fail to elicit this actual human response. They also stated that it simply turns somebody off by asking their weight, but I would argue that if I was alone and somebody randomly came up and asked me what my voice sounded like, I would also be plenty creeped out. It is absolutely unfair to say that the second sequence of questions inaccurately portrays what a person would want to answer when the first questions, if you're just trying to talk to somebody for the first time, are just as relevant. For our third contention of practicality, simply both sides agree that finding a friend is what's key in this resolution. I fail to see how asking any of the first questions would immediately lead to the development of any more than an absolutely meaningless friendship. Even if your favorite board game is exactly the same, how can we say that your actual deep human connection is anything past the mutual interest in that game? If you have this deeper interest with the second, if you have a deeper connection, which the second questions only can stimulate, a real friendship can be built upon which mutual interest can be developed and elaborated upon to create a friendship that is long lasting. Honorable speakers, when considering this resolution, I encourage you to recognize that the second questions are the only questions that further these actual human connections. And there is a reason why grown-ups gravitate towards these questions, because simply they are more practical and they elicit responses that the first questions possibly cannot match. The first questions are clearly disposed for children who do not have adequate exposure to the nature of making deep human connections. And when making a friend, that is what's most important, because we need to maintain this deep human connection to ensure that friendship persists. And for those reasons, I urge a strong side opposition ballot. Thank you.
Okay, Op, you have 4 minutes.
Yep.
just a little bit of a roadmap. I'm going to talk about the framework, and I'm going to talk about some of the weighing mechanisms about how we think about information, and then time permitting, I'll actually go through the questions. We'll see, though. I might not get to that. Okay. My time begins, now. So, Honorable Speaker, I want to start this speech off by really analyzing the framework that we started this debate with, because there have been a bunch of other questions here that don't actually matter. They said whichever side provides the better evaluation of the actual person you're talking to, whether you can be friends with them or not. Now, we also came to the conclusion that this should be determined by who can provide the most usable information, most important information, and information of value about that person. So that's how we should be actually analyzing this round. Because they said a bunch of things like, well, will they actually like you? Will this actually be the basis of a better friendship if you ask these questions? These are not important questions. If I go up to a random woman on the street and ask how much she weighs, of course we aren't going to be friends. That isn't the question in today's debate, though. The question is about evaluation. It's not about whether we're actually going to be more likely or less likely to be friends with them. And that's because of the framework that they themselves laid out. So with that sort of addressed, I want to now go through the actual ways that these questions differ from each other and how much information they receive, because there's been a bunch of clash about this in the entire debate. I'm going to simplify it down to basically 4 main categories. The first is the direct answer. The second is basically this idea of elaboration. The third is like, can you get this information from other means? And then finally, it's like, what is the actual reaction to these questions? So let's start with this first one, the direct answer. And again, I think you can go either way here, right? Both sides have really given you answers of why the direct answer to these questions is more important than the other one. I would argue that how old someone is really important. We talked about that. Basically, it's important to know whether somebody is 13 or 17, whether they're 14 or 16. All of these even small differences really matter in terms of whether you're going to be friends with them or not. So that's important. And I would argue that actually some of these other questions have a lot less importance, right? What does my voice sound like? We don't think the direct answer there actually matters that much, unless you take it with a philosophical point of view. And same thing with like, does he collect butterflies? There's less thing here. Secondly, we want to talk about this idea of elaboration, because we think it's really important. And there's been a bunch of clash in the entire debate. And of course, naturally, both sides have manipulated the answers to these questions in order to fit their own personal side. That's kind of inevitable in this entire debate. But here's why we actually win this point. Because essentially, we're not talking about whether you could or you could not take questions philosophically, because that goes to both sides. That's non-unique. Both sides, both individuals could take any question as a basis to actually have more reaction, to have more reflection. So what actually differentiates the two? We're not just saying that there's no way you can elaborate on the first and you can definitely elaborate on the second. We're saying you're more likely to elaborate on the second because they don't provide the necessary context. Number one actually gives you the answer to the context, whereas we'd argue that, again, for number two, all those questions don't give you
Point of order.
I talked about them in my very first speech. I was talking about context in response to your contentions about how like they offer context.
Can I say what I think is new first?
Sorry, yes, I apologize. I interrupted you there.
I think any like analysis of what is like more probable to like get you like an introspective response is new. You really didn't talk about like a comparison between the two. I mean, I don't know, up to the judge. I just don't think like this argument was made about how like you're more likely to have like elaboration. You just made this assertion that you have elaboration. So I think like it's like a new line of reasoning. Up to judges.
Just quick clarification of which argument are you saying is new? The idea that you elaborate with the second and not with the first?
Yeah, that whole idea is like pretty new.
I feel like that was the basis of a lot of our case, right? Is that you elaborate when you answer the first questions. Of course, you can put it under consideration.
Okay, yeah, the panel will take it under consideration. Each of us will make an individual decision.
And I apologize, Arnav, for interrupting you before you actually gave the POO. I see 2:20 on my clock, so I'm going to go from there, if that works.
Oh, you see were you giving a 5-minute speech or a 4-minute speech?
4 minutes.
Okay, for some reason I have 1:35. Was anybody else timing it?
1:35 left, right?
Right. Oh my God, yeah, we were talking about different things. 1:35 left. Yeah, go ahead.
Let me just, okay, yeah, I'm going from the elaboration point. So ultimately, we think that actually because of this necessary human desire to give context, that's what sets our side away from theirs. Because of course, both sides can give this elaboration or not give this elaboration. As I said in my first speech, both sides can essentially give what we need for our side, which sets it apart, is that you need to give context. And the human reaction is to give context to numbers that otherwise mean that otherwise might be like misconstrued, or you might not get the full picture. People want to give the full picture, they want to give context, and that's what sets our side apart. Now, thirdly, we're talking about other means. How can you figure out the answers to these questions by other things so that you don't waste a question on them? That's what the word we use a lot. And they argue that we actually kind of figure out how old someone is, how much they weigh, basically like seeing them and seeing them in their person. And we think that this is somewhat true, but not actually true, because you don't know the exact answer ever. Whereas you can totally know the exact answer of what exactly does your voice sound like. That's an answer that you can actually see directly. So this is what we think sets us apart in terms of other meanings, like practicality. Which questions can you be answered without needing to ever ask them? We think that while sure you can have an idea of those questions on their side, ultimately you can only get a real answer. You can only really answer these questions on the first one. Only those ones are actually implicit, they're implied, you can know them, they're obvious. But the last actual response here is reaction. And I think this is what actually wins us the debate today, because this has gone basically largely uncontested and it sort of flowed through the whole round. And that's the essential question of, this goes through our second contention. Not just will they elaborate or not, but what will their reaction to the question actually be? So through our second contention. Essentially the idea of when you ask them in a question like this, how will they react? How will they actually react to a prying question? As I said in the beginning, I don't want to be asked a really prying question about my weight or my age or anything like that. And so that is actually more information that only side opposition can actually give you. So no matter how you rule on all the other actual issues, that one is uncontested because only we have actually argued that you can draw something from the reaction to the question opposed to the answer to it. So that's ultimately what wins us this round, because we provide you more information and ultimately win this debate. Thank you very much.
All right, Gab, you have 5 minutes. Last speech of the tournament.
Okay. Everybody ready? There's gonna be mostly observations and then weighing. I mean, no, some observations and mostly weighing. Flip the order. But yes. Okay. Note in MO, they tell you, right, in the opposition, that the reason grown-ups ask quantitative questions is because they want to create more understanding, and the reason the kids' questions are frivolous is because they don't have experience in the world. Judge, let me pose a question to you. Who makes more friends, children or adults? I think it's quite clear who makes more friends, given my personal experience. I think when you're a kid, you have tons of friends because you're just interested in finding out how those people interact with you. But on the other hand, are you trying to do a PO?
Yeah, we just think it's a new argument that you're saying kids make more friends than adults.
That was an argument you made in the op block, so I'm allowed to respond to it. It's because the MO made the argument and the the LOC didn't make the argument, so I'm allowed to respond to it in this speech.
I would argue that it was already out, but again, doesn't take it under consideration.
Okay. Yeah, each of us will make a decision. I view at 4:21 left.
Yeah, I have something like that, yeah. All right, I'll start now. So I mean, okay, that's like not the big picture. That was like a small like refutation I wanted to make, which is like basically this basis of a lot of their argumentation or response that come out in the MO basically cuts itself in the back when you just note the simple observation that kids make more friends. Okay, so now I think we're gonna talk a little bit about like reflection and what it means to reflect that my partner talked about. Like all sort of just dropped, right? Not everybody is going to reflect on a question. There are some people who are reflective and there are some people who aren't. Let's split into those two cases and see who wins on getting that information and on getting that friendship. Note in the framework that the reason the framework is what type of questions allow you to best figure out if someone's going to be a good friend is because the motivation of the actor is to find a friend. Them telling you, Judge, that trying to find a friend is like not important in this round is sort of pointless when you consider the actual motivation for a framework, something I lay out in the PMC. So like our arguments about how you're going to scare people away matter in this round. Because the motivation of the actor is to find a friend. We just decided the framework because we really, frankly, didn't think opposition would be asking everybody what their weights are. We didn't think they would be doing this type of questions that would actually cause backlash. So we didn't really think it was like necessary to be involved in the framework. So let's just talk about reflection. Let's go into the information weighing. There are some people who are reflective, right? That are going to reflect to any question you give them. It doesn't matter if you give them a qualitative or a quantitative question. But what is the nature of that reflection? Let's talk about what side opposition gives us. They tell you, oh, you ask about how much they weigh. And here, they're going to tell you how they went about their struggles with like obesity. What is the comparative? When you ask someone what they like to do, they don't just tell you how they do it, they tell you why they do it. We think that why is a lot more valuable than the how, because why tells you their actual motivators. I talk about this so much in the PMC, and it goes dropped. Because why tells you how this person views the world, and if that view is going to line up with yours, and that is crucial because that is what tells you if you're going to be able to be friends with them. Just knowing what they have done doesn't give you any information about whether they're going to be good friends with you. Knowing that someone struggled with obesity doesn't tell you, right, if they're going to be good friends with you. But if you ask them if they've experienced any trauma and they tell you why they experienced that trauma, how and why like obesity actually had an impact on them, you're going to learn about them as a person rather than them as the actions they've taken. This has been the whole message of side government that side opposition hasn't responded to. It's not about amount of information, it's about quality. But note that if the person isn't reflective, then what information do you get? From the quantitative question, you just get a what? You get a number that doesn't tell you anything about the person. But from the qualitative questions, you get the how, you get the what they do. You get what games they play. What's it called? Go and catch butterflies. They try to brush off this butterfly question, but Judge, I'd contend that someone saying, yes, I collect butterflies gives you a lot of insight about their character and about how they're probably gentle people who are very curious about the little things in the world. These questions give you insight, whether you take them at the minimal, which is these three, or you take them at the big picture, which is a comparison between qualitative and quantitative questions. I think they failed to talk about the comparative, which is why you're voting government in this round. They basically act like qualitative questions are frivolous without realizing that qualitative questions give you better reflection if the person is reflective, and if they aren't reflective, quantitative questions are literally meaningless. Because all of those benefits they talk about in all of their opposition speeches only result if the person is reflective. There is like a 70-80% probability, because I don't think most people are reflective individuals to that degree, that you just get zero information from their questions. Because these questions are just super surface level, like how much do you weigh? Oh, I weigh like 120 pounds. Or you're just like, look, I don't want to answer this question. I don't want to deal with you, right? Most people aren't going to give you reflection on these surface level quantitative questions. That's a reality they fail to deal with. They assume everyone's reflective, which is a big flaw in their case. Now we talk about reaction. They try to argue that reaction matters and it doesn't matter. We'd say it matters. We'd agree with their second assumption. If people backlash against your questions, the point of you asking them is bankrupt, because now you just cannot be friends with them. If you ask them how much they weigh, they get offended and leave, then it doesn't matter if I give you information to help you become a friend if they don't want to be a friend with you anymore. They tell you it doesn't matter, but it matters because it's the very crux of this round. This round is about what better makes you have friends, and the reason we're mainly talking about what gives you more information is because the information, again, helps you make those friends. When we talk about the motive of the actor, their best case is they get the same qualitative info in a more indirect manner, but they push people away from them. And that's why you vote for government, because their best case scenario is our scenario, but also pushes people away, makes them less likely to be your friends. And for that reason, I'm so proud to propose.
All right, really good round, everybody. I think you've given us a lot to think about, so